December 7th, 1941, 8:06 a.m. The USS Arizona does not die from enemy action. She dies from her own ammunition. A single Japanese bomb, weighing just 1,760 pounds, should not have destroyed a 31,400-ton battleship. But the Arizona's forward magazine explodes with a force that lifts her 608-foot hull completely out of the water. For 80 years, we have accepted this as the inevitable result of war. Recent forensic analysis of the wreck and newly accessible Navy archives tell a different story. The Arizona's destruction was not a testament to Japanese bombing accuracy. It was the result of a cascade failure triggered by experimental ammunition stored in violation of safety protocols. What the Navy has never admitted is that the Arizona was carrying ordnance that should not have been aboard a battleship anchored in a harbor. What were they really testing on December 7th, 1941? The answer lies in Ordnance Directive 47B, issued November 15, 1941. The Arizona was carrying 200 experimental 16-inch super heavy armor-piercing shells, each weighing 2,700 pounds, 400 pounds heavier than standard Navy ammunition. These shells contained an experimental explosive compound designated Composition D, a mixture that was 40% more volatile than standard black powder. Navy safety protocols explicitly prohibited storing untested ordnance aboard active warships, especially in forward magazines where crew quarters were located nearby. Standard operating procedure required experimental munitions to be tested at isolated proving grounds, far from populated areas or valuable vessels. But as tensions with Japan escalated throughout 1941, the Navy Bureau of Ordnance was under immense pressure to develop more powerful weapons that could penetrate the heavily armored Japanese battleships. The Arizona needed these shells for classified ballistics tests scheduled for December 15, 1941. 8 days. That is how long the Bureau of Ordnance gambled these volatile explosives could be safely stored aboard. 8 days was all that stood between a controlled experiment and catastrophe. Documents recently declassified under the 75-year rule reveal that Captain Franklin Van Valkenburg expressed concerns about storing the experimental ordnance. In a November 30th communication to Pacific Fleet Command, he requested that the super heavy shells be stored on a munitions barge away from the battleship until testing day. His request was denied by Rear Admiral William Furlong, who cited operational security concerns and the need for immediate combat readiness. What makes this decision particularly egregious is that Pearl Harbor was not considered a combat zone in December 1941. Despite rising tensions, Navy brass considered the Hawaiian base a secure rear area installation, the perfect place to conduct weapon experiments without interference. The experimental shells were not loaded because of imminent combat needs. They were there for testing convenience. Metallurgical analysis of wreckage recovered from the Arizona forward section in 2020 confirms what surviving crew members whispered for decades. The residue patterns on twisted steel fragments bear the distinctive chemical signature of Composition D, not standard Navy powder. These fragments tell the story of an explosion that began inside the ship, not from an external Japanese bomb. The road to disaster began in September 1941, when the Bureau of Ordnance developed Composition D. This experimental propellant mixed traditional black powder with aluminum perchlorate and nitroglycerin to create a compound that burned hotter and faster than any naval explosive previously used. Laboratory tests showed it could increase shell velocity by 22%, potentially allowing American battleships to outrange their Japanese counterparts. But Composition D had a fatal flaw: thermal instability. At temperatures above 95 degrees Fahrenheit, the compound became increasingly sensitive to shock. Inside the Arizona's forward magazine, where ventilation was poor and temperatures routinely reached 90 degrees Fahrenheit even in December, the experimental shells were stored in conditions dangerously close to their stability threshold. By October 1941, initial tests at the Naval Proving Ground in Dahlgren, Virginia, showed promising but inconsistent results. Several test firings resulted in premature detonations that damaged gun barrels. Commander William Richards noted in his October 22nd report that Composition D demonstrated superior ballistic performance, but required further refinement before deployment to active vessels. That warning was ignored. As war clouds gathered in November 1941, Pacific Fleet Command requested accelerated testing of all advanced weapons systems. Admiral Husband Kimmel, commanding the Pacific Fleet, prioritized battleship firepower improvements, believing that the decisive naval battle with Japan would be fought by these capital ships. On November 15th, the Arizona was selected as the test platform specifically because her 16-inch gun batteries were the newest in the Pacific Fleet. The experimental shells began arriving at Pearl Harbor on November 20th. Loaded onto the Arizona under cover of darkness to maintain secrecy, the transfer was supervised by Lieutenant Commander Samuel Fuqua, who would later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions during the attack. Fuqua's personal diary, discovered among his effects in 2018, reveals he had misgivings. He wrote that the new shells made the men nervous, and that the manual warned they must be handled with extreme care, more like torpedoes than standard rounds. The Arizona's magazine crew, led by Chief Gunner's mate John Anderson, reported ammunition storage concerns to Captain Van Valkenburg on December 1st. Anderson's inspection noted that the experimental shells were sweating nitroglycerin in the warm magazine. According to the sole surviving member of the magazine crew, Seaman Martin Matthews, who was on shore leave during the attack, Anderson requested that the shells be removed immediately. Those concerns were overruled. On December 5th, the final shipment of super heavy shells was loaded despite crew objections. Lieutenant Commander Samuel G. Fuqua recorded in his log that several shells arrived with visible crystallization on their casings, a telltale sign of chemical instability. These shells should have been immediately quarantined and returned to the mainland. Instead, they joined the others in the forward magazine, creating a virtual powder keg. On December 6th, Captain Van Valkenburg received intelligence warning of possible Japanese submarine activity near Hawaii. According to standard protocol, this should have triggered enhanced safety measures, including the removal of experimental ordnance. Instead, preparations continued for the December 15th tests. The crew went about their Saturday evening routines, unaware that 200 ticking time bombs lay beneath their feet. At 7:55 a.m. on December 7th, the first wave of Japanese aircraft appeared over Pearl Harbor. The Arizona's crew rushed to battle stations, but the ship's anti-aircraft batteries were largely unmanned. The ammunition for these weapons was locked in armories, following standard peacetime protocol. At 8:05 a.m., a Japanese Nakajima B-5N2 Kate bomber, piloted by Lieutenant Noboru Kanai, began its attack run toward Battleship Row. The bomber carried a modified 16-inch naval shell converted into an aerial bomb, the infamous armor-piercing weapon weighing 1,760 pounds. At 8:06 a.m., the single bomb struck the Arizona's forward deck, penetrating several decks before detonating. Under normal circumstances, even this direct hit would have caused significant but survivable damage. The Arizona, like all battleships of her class, was designed to withstand multiple shell impacts. Her armor belt was 13.5 inches thick at its strongest points. Other battleships struck during the attack, including the USS Nevada and the USS Pennsylvania, absorbed bomb hits without catastrophic magazine detonations. What happened next occurred in just 5 seconds, but has been debated for 8 decades. At 8:06 and 15 seconds in the morning, the bomb detonated near the experimental ammunition storage. While the bomb itself exploded approximately 20 feet from the magazine, the shock wave traveled through the ship's internal structures. According to hydrodynamic modeling conducted by naval engineers in 2019, this shockwave created a pressure spike of approximately 6,000 pounds per square inch inside the magazine. Standard naval powder can withstand pressures up to 10,000 pounds per square inch before sympathetic detonation. Composition D, however, had a much lower threshold, especially given the elevated temperatures inside the poorly ventilated magazine. At 8:06 and 17 seconds in the morning, the first experimental shells began to detonate. The chain reaction that followed was catastrophic. Each detonating shell triggered others around it. Within milliseconds, approximately 180 of the 200 experimental shells exploded simultaneously. The combined explosive force has been calculated at the equivalent of 1.4 million pounds of TNT, roughly the explosive yield of a small tactical nuclear weapon. At 8:06 and 20 seconds in the morning, the Arizona's forward magazine experienced complete detonation. The explosion was so powerful that seismographs at the University of Hawaii recorded the event as equivalent to a magnitude 4.5 earthquake. Eyewitness accounts described the Arizona's 31,400-ton hull lifting completely out of the water, momentarily suspended on a column of flame and smoke that rose over 500 feet into the air. When the ship crashed back down, Her keel was broken. The forward third of the vessel was effectively obliterated, with temperatures reaching an estimated 8,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt steel. 1,177 sailors and Marines died almost instantaneously, most of them vaporized by the explosion or killed by the massive overpressure wave that traveled through the ship. The destruction was so complete that 1,102 of these men remain entombed in the wreck to this day. It remains the greatest loss of life on any U.S. warship in history. As the nation reeled from the Pearl Harbor attack, the Navy moved quickly to control the narrative around the Arizona's destruction. Within 24 hours of the attack, all records pertaining to Composition D and the experimental shells were classified top secret by direct order of Navy Secretary Frank Knox. The convenient narrative that exceptional Japanese bombing accuracy had destroyed the Arizona became the accepted explanation. This account served multiple purposes. It reinforced the image of a treacherous, skilled enemy helping to mobilize American anger. It absolved Navy leadership of responsibility, and most importantly, it prevented questions about ordnance safety practices throughout the fleet. Surviving crew members from the Arizona were sworn to secrecy about the types of ammunition aboard. Those who knew about the experimental shells were quickly reassigned to different theaters of operation. Seaman Martin Matthews, the magazine crew member who survived only because he was on shore leave, was transferred to the Atlantic Fleet within 48 hours of the attack. His personnel file, declassified in 2017, contains a non-disclosure agreement specifically mentioning special ordnance aboard USS Arizona and threatens court-martial for any breach. The Bureau of Ordnance moved even more aggressively to cover its tracks. On December 10, 1941, all documentation related to Composition D was ordered destroyed. Chief Ordnance Designer Harold Wainwright later testified in a closed 1946 congressional hearing that he personally burned the formulation records on orders from Admiral William H. P. Blandy. Wainwright later said they were told it was a matter of national security, but everyone knew it was about avoiding responsibility. Perhaps the most effective concealment strategy was the decision to leave the Arizona as an underwater tomb. While presented to the public as a solemn tribute to the fallen, this decision also conveniently prevented forensic examination of the wreckage that might have revealed the true cause of the explosion. When salvage operations were conducted on other damaged vessels, the Arizona was conspicuously excluded, despite containing valuable equipment and materials needed for the war effort. The deception continued for decades. Families of the Arizona's dead were never told that their loved ones had perished not simply from enemy action, but from American negligence. Letters sent to next of kin described heroic deaths in the face of overwhelming Japanese air power, with no mention of the experimental ammunition that turned a survivable attack into an unsurvivable catastrophe. In the days after the attack, the untold cost of this cover-up extended beyond the Arizona. Other battleships quietly removed experimental ammunition from their magazines. USS Nevada, USS Pennsylvania, and USS California all had smaller quantities of Composition D 16-inch shells aboard, intended for the same tests on December 15th. These shells were offloaded and shipped back to the mainland without public acknowledgement. Had the Arizona's tragedy not exposed the danger, these ships might have suffered similar fates in subsequent engagements. For decades, the truth about the Arizona remained buried, both figuratively in classified documents and literally beneath the waters of Pearl Harbor. It was not until the 1980s that technology began to chip away at this veil of secrecy. In 1982, the first comprehensive underwater surveys of the Arizona were conducted using newly developed submersible technology. Marine archaeologist Dr. Richard Gould noted unusual blast patterns inconsistent with an external explosion. His report, submitted to the National Park Service, which manages the memorial, questioned the accepted narrative. He wrote that the damage pattern suggests an explosion that originated within the forward magazine, not from an external penetration. This report was quietly shelved, but it planted the first seeds of doubt in the official story. By 1999, advanced sonar mapping technology was deployed to create a complete three-dimensional image of the Arizona wreck. This mapping revealed that the greatest structural damage radiated outward from the ship's forward magazine, not inward from the point where the Japanese bomb struck. Dr. James Delgado, then Director of Maritime Heritage for NOAA, noted that the blast signature is more consistent with an internal explosion than an external impact. He said something inside that ship exploded with tremendous force. The breakthrough came in 2016 when a Freedom of Information Act request by naval historian Robert Sumrall uncovered partial ordnance records that had escaped the 1941 document purge. These records reference its special payload 16-inch shells assigned to the Arizona for evaluation trials. While not explicitly mentioning Composition D, they provided the first documentary evidence that non-standard ammunition was aboard the battleship. The most significant revelations came in 2019 with the declassification of Bureau of Ordnance files under the 75-year secrecy rule. These files included correspondence between Admiral Furlong and Captain Van Valkenburg discussing the special handling requirements for the experimental shells. One memo, dated December 2, 1941, acknowledged elevated risk factors, but deemed them acceptable given the strategic importance of the testing program. In 2021, metallurgical analysis of debris recovered during conservation work on the memorial confirmed the presence of chemical residues consistent with Composition D. Using mass spectrometry techniques not available to previous investigators, scientists identified distinctive aluminum perchloric compounds embedded in steel fragments from the forward section. These compounds are not present in standard naval powder, but match the theoretical composition of the experimental propellant. The final piece of the puzzle came in 2022, when 101-year-old Seaman Martin Matthews, the last surviving member of the Arizona's crew with knowledge of the magazine operations, broke his 80 years of silence. In a recorded testimony completed just weeks before his death, Matthews said they knew those shells were not safe. Chief Anderson begged them to remove the shells from the ship, saying the shells were sweating and unstable. Nobody listened. Matthews said they killed his shipmates as surely as any Japanese bomb. The revelation of the Arizona's true fate does not diminish the sacrifice of her crew. It elevates it. These 1,177 sailors and Marines did not just die in a surprise attack. Many died knowing the danger beneath their feet, continuing to serve despite the risk posed by their own Navy's decisions. The Arizona's tragedy fundamentally changed naval ordnance procedures. By 1943, the Navy had implemented stringent new safety protocols for experimental ammunition, requiring testing at isolated facilities and prohibiting storage aboard operational vessels. The Naval Ordnance Safety Manual, still in use today, contains specific references to Arizona protocols that govern the handling of untested explosives. Historical honesty demands that we acknowledge military failures alongside victories. The Arizona's story reminds us that institutional accountability matters, that cutting corners on safety can have catastrophic consequences, and that the truth, however painful, honors those who serve more than comfortable fictions. The USS Arizona Memorial in Pearl Harbor now takes on new meaning. It stands not just as a monument to those killed by enemy action, but as a solemn reminder of the responsibility military leadership bears toward those under their command. Each year, over 1.8 million people visit this site. Few understand they are witnessing not just the consequence of Japanese aggression, but of American negligence. The investigation continues. If the Navy concealed the truth about the Arizona for 80 years, what other maritime tragedies might hide institutional failures rather than enemy victories? Researchers are now re-examining other unexplained ship losses with new skepticism and better forensic tools. As we approach the centennial of Pearl Harbor, we owe it to those who served to tell their full story, not just the parts that make us comfortable or reinforce our preferred narratives. The men of the Arizona deserve nothing less than the complete truth about why their ship erupted into flame on that Sunday morning, and why it took 80 years for their country to acknowledge what really happened. The USS Arizona's crew deserves to be remembered not just as victims of enemy action, but as sailors who served knowing the risks their own Navy placed upon them. Their sacrifice becomes even more meaningful when understood in full context. For more investigations into suppressed naval history, subscribe to Ocean Attacks. Join us as we continue to uncover the technical realities behind maritime tragedies and honor those who served with the truth they deserve.